Alright, we are a little past 8 o'clock, but it's been a weird day. So, let's settle in, get comfortable, and see what tonight has in store as we get back to a new to us book with Demian. Welcome back. Tonight is our second night reading this very interesting story by Hermann Hesse, Demian. This one is kind of hard to put a real finger on to decide exactly what kind of story it is. It's something of a coming-of-age story. It's something of a glimpse into, at least in the first chapter, 2 chapters I think we had, it's a glimpse into the mind of a child who is very accurately portrayed as having completely blown a very minor problem way out of proportion, and it may have been his own fault to begin with, because he may have felt a need to be accepted by the new, well, not friends, because he really didn't like any of the boys he was telling his story to at the beginning, but just a need for acceptance in general. And, well, that went downhill pretty quickly. Got himself landed as a target for bullying and extortion, and he just sort of went along with it for fear of Lord only knows. And at the end, when it was all resolved through some advice and help from his strangely endearing and charismatic but possessed of odd opinions new friend, or new upperclassman at school, Demian, Well, the boy, yes, it all was resolved, such and such, but in the back of his mind and deep in his heart, he knows that nothing will really be the same. He's started to see the path to maturity, the realization that you don't necessarily always agree with your parents. Don't necessarily find that they are perfect. Which in this case is entirely unwarranted, because he was the one that was at fault in the first place. But that's neither here nor there. But that's one of the key hallmarks of the death of innocence, is realizing that you don't have to have the same opinions as your parents. That can go several different ways. It could be that your parents are actually possessed of very bad opinions, and you are in the right for getting rid of them. And it can also be that they are possessed of entirely reasonable opinions, and you're a little git. Also entirely plausible. Some mixture of the both. And also very, very reasonably and possible options. But in this case, it's, well, the kid's in his head way too much. So, let's see how this goes tonight. Because last time we saw the boy mention to his father the opinions that Demian had of Cain. And his father was understandably put off, because that is blasphemy of the highest order in their circles. Not necessarily that the idea itself is heinous. No, the insinuation that the loving God and creator of all was fallible in some sort of way, was not right in what was done to Cain and the sons of Cain. Well, I'm not here to go into theology. It's been a very many years since I was at a Bible study. It's been a very many years since I gave half a shit about anything that goes on between the covers of the Bible. But sometimes it does make for good conversation. Usually it makes for good conversation when you're not belittling it like I have just done, but we're on the internet, and it's okay to be a little edgy. Anyway, let's go ahead and shift back and find our focus on this book and see how it is going to develop. So, we're beginning tonight with Chapter 3. We got through just about a quarter of the book last time, with a fair bit of preamble, a fair bit of yammering on, and losing the plot a little bit. So, I think we're probably going to be fairly on pace to finish this book in between 3 and 4 readings, depending on whether we run long or blissfully punch out at the end of our time. So, let's resume now with Chapter 3 of Demian, the Thief on the Cross. I could describe scenes of my childhood, spent in peaceful security at the side of father and mother, relate how I passed this period of my life, playing contentedly in the midst of surroundings brightened by love and tenderness. But others have done that. I am only interested in the steps I took in life, in order to attain self-realization. All the pretty resting places, happy isles, and children's paradises whose charm is not unknown to me, I leave lying behind me in the shimmer of a distant horizon, and I have no desire to set foot there again. Now, before we continue, I'm not really a fan of this BGM in this context. I like this BGM, but not really for this book. I did find the reason why we had more or less abandoned Piano Magic. Despite how much I do like that BGM, it has some playback issues. I do believe it's just not working when it wants to. It worked when I opened OBS. But as I cue it up now, it's not doing a damn thing. Yeah, no, nothing. So, we will have to leave Piano Magic by the side for now, again. Oh, could you? Well, maybe it just doesn't like my... Let's shift back then, I'll hit that. Maybe it doesn't go through my monitor, which is odd, but I guess not unheard of. Well, I'll be damned. Yep, it just doesn't like the monitor, which is a little off-putting, as I cannot hear it on my end, particularly since I have the actual preview stream on the other muted, because I don't want to hear myself coming through. But anyway, I'm happy to hear that it's working. I'll just let it keep going. If the BGM does cut out, let me know. We might use Piano Magic a little bit more. It apparently is working all along and just decided to play tricks on me. Alright, getting back into it. For that reason, I will speak. So far as I intend to dwell on the period of my childhood, only of new events which overtook me, of what impelled me forward, enabling me to throw off my shackles. Okay, now it kicks in on the... So I guess it just needs to go through an entire cycle of playback and hit the first loop where it goes into my monitor. OBS. Yeah, OBS, you are very special. These impulses always came from the other world. They always brought fear, coercion, and a bad conscience in their train. They were always of a revolutionary tendency, and danger to the peace in which I would willingly have been allowed to remain. There came the years in which I had to discover anew that there was within me an instinct which had to lie close and concealed in the bright world of moral sanction. As to every man, the slowly awakening sense of sex came to me as an enemy and a destroyer, as something forbidden, as seduction and sin. What my curiosity sought to know, what caused me dreams, desire, and fear, the great secret of puberty, that was not at all in keeping with the guarded happiness of my peaceful childhood. I did as everyone else. I led the double life of a child who is yet a child no longer. My conscious self lived under the conditions sanctioned at home. It denied the existence of the new world whose dawn glimmered before me. But I lived as well in dreams, impelled by desires of a secret nature, upon which my conscience was self-anxiously attempted to build a new fabric, as the world of my childhood fell in ruins about me. Like almost all parents, my own did nothing to help the awakening life instincts, about which not a syllable was uttered. They only aided with untiring care my hopeless attempts to deny the reality, and to continue my existence in a childlike world which was ever becoming more unreal and more mendacious. I do not know whether parents can do much in such a case, and I make mine no reproach. It was my own affair, to settle my difficulties and to find my way, and I carried through the business badly, like most of those who are well brought up. At least he's not blaming it on his parents for having a confusing adolescence. Yeah. The fact that he just slipped mendacious in there is like, the irony cuts deep. I'm actually fantastically pleased with this translation. This was originally in German, mind you. I would not have guessed that this was not a native English book from what we've read so far. Oh, creeping mendacity indeed. I knew we'd get along for good reason. Alright, Every man passes through this difficulty. For the average person, this is the point in his life where the demands of his own life come most in conflict with his surroundings, where the road forward has to be attained through the bitterest fighting. For many people, this is the only time in their lives that they experience the sequence of death and rebirth that is our fate, when they become conscious of the slow process of the decay and breaking up of the world of their childhood, when everything beloved of us leaves us, and we suddenly feel the loneliness and deathly cold of the universe around us. And for very many, this pitfall is fatal. They cling their whole life long painfully to the irrevocable past, to the dream of a lost paradise, the worst and most deadly of all dreams. But to return to the story, the sensations and dream pictures in which the close of a childhood presented itself to me are not important enough to be described. The important point was that I was once again conscious of the existence of the dark world, the other world. What Frank Cromer had once been to me was now present within myself, and so, from the outside as well, the other world once more gained power over me. Several years had passed since my affair with Cromer. That dramatic and guilty time of my life lay far behind me at that time, and seemed to have passed like a quick nightmare into nothingness. Frank Cromer had long since disappeared from my life. I scarcely gave it a moment's thought if I chanced to meet him. But the other important figure in my tragedy, Max Demian, never entirely disappeared from my life. However, for a long time he stood on the far horizon, visible but not affecting me. Only by degrees he approached me again, and I came once more under the ray of his power and influence. I will try to recollect what I know of Demian in that period. Perhaps for a year or longer I did not have a single conversation with him. I avoided him, and he in no wise forced himself on me. Once or twice when we met, he nodded to me in friendly greeting. Then it seemed to me at times that there was a note of scorn or ironical reproach in his friendliness, but that might only have been imagination on my part. My relation with him and the strange influence he had exercised over me were as if forgotten, by him as well by me. I try to recall his face. As I recollect him, I see that I was conscious of his existence after all, and took notice of him. I can see him going to school, alone or with some of the other big boys. I see him walking among them like a stranger, lonely and still, like a celestial body, enveloped in a different atmosphere and subject to his own laws. No one liked him. He was intimate with no one, except his mother, and his relations with her did not seem like those of a child, but those of a grown-up person. The masters left him as much as possible in peace. He was a good pupil, but he did not go out of his way to please them. From time to time we heard in gossip of a word, a comment or a retort he had made to a master, which left nothing to be desired in the way of blunt challenge or irony. I call him to mind as I close my eyes, and I see his picture emerge. Where was it? Ah, now I have it again. It was in the street, in front of our house. There one day I saw him standing, a notebook in his hand. I saw that he was drawing. He was drawing the old crest with the bird over the door of our house, and I stood at a window, concealed behind a curtain, and gazed at him. I saw with astonishment his attentive, cool, bright features turned to the crest, the features of a man, of a research worker, or an artist, superior and full of willpower, oddly bright and cool, with knowing eyes. And again, I can see him. It was a little later, in the street. We had come out of school, and were all standing round a horse that had fallen down. It lay, still harnessed to the shaft, in front of a peasant's cart, and sniffed the air pitifully with open nostrils, while blood flowed from an invisible wound, so that the white dust in the street darkened as it became slowly saturated. As I, with a feeling of nausea, turned my gaze away, I saw Demian's face. He had not pressed forward. He stood furthest back of all, rather elegant, quite at his ease, as was proper to him. His gaze seemed to be directed at the horse's head, and expressed again that deep, quiet, almost fanatical, and yet calm attentiveness. I could not resist watching him some considerable time, and I remember feeling, though quite unconsciously, that there was something very peculiar about him. I saw Demian's face. I saw not only that he had not the face of a boy, but that of a man. I saw still more. I thought I saw, or felt, that it was not the face of a man either. Something else besides. There seemed to be also something of the woman in his features, and particularly it seemed to me for a moment not manly or boyish, not nor old nor young, but somehow or other 1,000 years old, and not to be measured by time, bearing the stamp of other epochs. Animals could look like that, or trees or stones. I did not realize that precisely. I did not experience the exact sensation which I, a grown-up person, am now describing. But what I felt then approximated in some way to what I have just related. Perhaps he was beautiful. Perhaps he pleased me. Perhaps even he was repugnant. I could not then determine. I saw only that he was different from us. He was like an animal, or a spirit, or a picture. I know not what he was like, but he was different. Inconceivably different from us all. My reminiscence tells me nothing more, and perhaps even what has been described has arisen in part from later impressions. Until I was several years older, I did not come into close contact with him again. Contrary to custom, Demian had not been confirmed with the boys of his year, and in consequence, fresh rumors concerning him were set afloat. In school, they were again saying that he was really a Jew, or no, a heathen, and others pretended to know that he and his mother professed no religion, and they belonged to a bad sect in mythology. In connection with this, I seem to remember that he was suspected of living with his mother as with a mistress. Presumably, the facts were that he had been, up to that time, brought up without any denominational creed, that it was now thought that this might be disadvantageous for his future career. In any case, his mother now decided that, after all, to allow him to be prepared for confirmation, 2 years later than the boys of his own age. Hence it came about that for months he was my classmate in the confirmation class. For a time I kept out of his way. I did not want to have anything to do with him. Too many mysterious rumors had become attached to his name, but above all things I was worried by a sense of obligation, implanted in me since my affair with Cromer, and just at that time I had enough to do with my own secrets, for the confirmation class coincided with the period when I was definitively enlightened on matters of sex, and in spite of my goodwill, my interest in the pious instruction was, on that account, greatly diminished. The things of which the clergyman spoke lay far from me in a still, sacred unreality. They may have been quite beautiful and valuable, but in no way real and stirring, as were in the highest degree these other things. The more indifferent I became under these conditions to our spiritual instruction, the more was my interest drawn towards Max Demian again. Something or other seemed to unite us. As nearly as I remember, it began in class early one morning. while the light was still burning in the schoolroom. The clergyman, taking the confirmation class, happened to be talking about Cain and Abel. I hardly paid any attention. I was sleepy and scarcely listened. Then, with raised voice, the clergyman began to speak fervently of Cain's sign. At this moment I felt a sort of contact or exhortation, and looking up I saw Demian's face turned toward me from a row of desks in front, with a bright, speaking look, which could have expressed scorn as much as seriousness. He looked at me for a moment only, and suddenly I was listening intently to the clergyman's words. I heard him speak of Cain and the mark on his forehead, and suddenly I felt deep within me the knowledge that the story could have a different signification, that it could be looked at from another view, that it was possible to be critical. From that instant, the bond of communication between Demian and myself was again established, and, oddly enough, scarcely had this sense of a certain solidarity between us presented itself to my mind than I saw it transferred, as if by magic, from the ideal world to the world of space. I did not know whether he had been able to arrange it himself, or whether it was pure chance. At that time I believed firmly in chance. But a few days after, I noticed Demian had suddenly changed his place, and was now sitting directly in front of me. I recollect still how pleasant it was, in the midst of the miserable workhouse atmosphere of the overcrowded schoolroom, to sense the delicate, fresh aroma of soap from his neck in the morning. A few days later he had changed again, and now sat next to me, and there he stayed, occupying the same place through the whole of that winter and spring. Morning lessons had quite changed. They were no longer sleepy and boring. I looked forward to them. Sometimes we both listened to the clergyman with the greatest attention. A glance from my neighbor would suffice, calling my attention to a strange story, or a peculiar text. And another glance from him, a very decided one, acted on me as an admonition, arousing criticism and doubt. But very often we were bad pupils, and heard nothing of the lesson. Demian was always courteous toward masters and schoolfellows. I never saw him commit a schoolboy prank, never heard him laugh out loud or talk in class. He never drew on himself the master's blame, but noiselessly, rather by sounds and glances than by whispered words, he knew how to let me share in his own occupations. These were in part of a peculiar nature. For instance, he told me which of the fellows interested him, and in what manner he studied them. He judged many of them with accuracy. He used to say to me before the lesson, "When I signal you with my thumb, so-and-so will look round at us, or will scratch his neck," etc. Then, during the lesson, when I scarcely gave a thought to what he had told me, Max would attract my attention by suddenly bending his thumb. I would look up quickly at the boy already designated, and every time, as if attached to a wire, the fellow would make the gesture required of him. I bothered Max to try this on the master, but he did not want to do it. But once, when I came into class and told him I had not done my preparation, and that I hoped the clergyman would not question me that day, he helped me. The master looked round for a boy to recite a portion of the catechism, and his roving eye rested on me. He approached me slowly, stretched out his finger in my direction, and already had my name on his lips when suddenly he became absent-minded or uneasy, put his hand on his collar, stepped up to Demian, who looked fixedly into his face. He seemed to want to ask him something, but he turned away to our surprise, coughed a little, and put his question to another boy. These jokes amused me very much, but only gradually did I notice that my friend frequently played the same game with me. It would happen that on my way home from school I had suddenly the feeling that Demian was a little way behind me. When I turned round, there he was, sure enough, Can you really make another person think what you want him to? I asked him. He gave me information on the subject readily enough, quietly and pertinently, in his grown-up manner. No, he said, that can't be done. That is to say, one hasn't a free will, even if the person acts that way. Neither can the other person think as he will, nor can I make him think what I want him to. But you can observe someone well, and then you can say fairly exactly what he thinks or feels. In this way you can generally predict what he will do the moment after. It's quite simple, but people merely do not know it. Naturally, it requires practice. To take an example from the butterfly world, there is a certain species of moth, of which the female is much rarer than the male. The moths reproduce like other animals. The male impregnates the female, who then lays the egg. Suppose you have in your possession a female of this type of moth. Naturalists have often made the experiment. Then the male moths fly in the night to this female. They even make a flight of several hours' duration. Think of it! For many miles all around, all the males are conscious of the whereabouts of the only female moth in the district. People have tried to explain that, but it is not easy. Moths must have a sense of smell, or something like it, which allows them to pick up and follow an almost imperceptible scent, like a good hound. You understand? There are such things, nature is full of them, and no one can explain them. Now, I draw the conclusion that if among the class of moths the females were as abundant as the males, then these latter would not have such a refined sense of smell. They have it simply because they have been trained like that. If an animal or a man concentrates his whole attention and his whole willpower on a certain thing, then he attains it. That's all. And it is just the same with what you have asked me. Observe a man sufficiently well, and you will know more about him than he does himself. It lay on the tip of my tongue to mention the word mind-reading. And so to remind him of the scene with Cromer, now relegated to such a distant past. But the odd thing between us both was that neither he nor I ever made the slightest reference to the fact that several years ago he had intervened so decisively in my life. It was as if formerly there had been nothing between us. Or as if each of us reckoned that the other had forgotten the affair. It even happened once or twice when we were together that we met Frank Cromer in the street. But we exchanged no look, neither did we speak of him. But what has that got to do with willpower? I asked. You said there was no such thing as free will, and then you said one only had to concentrate one's will on something to be able to attain one's ends. That doesn't agree. If I'm not the master of my will, then I can't direct it here or there as I wish. A good question, he said, laughing. You should always ask questions. You must always doubt. But the explanation is very simple. If a moth, for instance, wants to concentrate his willpower on a star or something like that, he can't do it. Only, he doesn't try. He seeks only what has sense and value for him. Satisfies his needs. He gets what he absolutely must have, and it is just there that the unbelievable succeeds. He develops a marvelous sixth sense that no other animal besides him has. People in our position have more elbow room, certainly, and more interest than an animal, but even we are confined to a comparatively small space, beyond which we cannot go. To be sure, I can imagine this or that, or make myself believe that I absolutely want to get to the North Pole or somewhere, but I can only carry that out and wish it strongly enough when the desire lies right in myself, when my whole being is really filled with it. As soon as that is the case, as soon as you try to carry out an inward command, then you succeed. Then you can harness your will as you would a good nag. If, for instance, I resolve that our good Mr. Parson shall not wear his spectacles for the future, then that I wouldn't work. That is merely play, but when last autumn I had the fixed intention of getting myself moved to another desk, I succeeded. Someone suddenly arrived who came before me in the alphabet, and who up to then had been ill. Because someone had to make room for him, it was naturally I who did it, because my willing it had made me ready to seize the opportunity. Yes, I said. That seemed to me very strange at the time. But from the moment we began to get interested in one another, you managed to get nearer and nearer to me. But now, how was that? You did not immediately take place next to me. For a few lessons at first, you were sitting in the row of desks in front of me, weren't you? How did that come about? It was like this. I wasn't quite certain where I wanted to go when I wished to move from my first place. I only knew that I wanted to sit further back. It was my wish to move towards you, but I was not conscious of this at the time. Simultaneously, your own will was working with mine, and helped me. It was only when I sat in front of you that I realized my wish was only half fulfilled. I noticed that, really, I desired nothing else than to sit next to you. But on that occasion, no newcomer arrived. No, but then I simply did what I wished, and sat next to you without hesitation. The boy with whom I changed places was simply surprised, and let me do it without further say, and the person indeed noticed once that a change had taken place in the parson. In fact, whenever he looks at me, something worries him, secretly. That is to say, he knows my name is Demian, and that something must be wrong that I, whose initial is D, am sitting back there among the S's. But that does not penetrate his consciousness, because my will is against it, because I prevent him again and again from becoming conscious of it. He notices how, now and then, that something is wrong. He looks at me and begins to study the question. The good fellow. But I have a simple means at my disposal. I look at him very, very fixedly in the eyes. Hardly anyone can bear that. They always get restive. If you want to get something out of a person, and you fix him unexpectedly with your eyes, and if he doesn't get restive, then give it up. You won't get anything out of him, ever. But that happens seldom. I know only one single person with whom this trick won't help me. Who's that? I asked quickly. He looked at me, with eyes somewhat closed, as his fashion was when he meditated. Then he looked away and gave no answer, and in spite of my lively curiosity, I could not bring myself to repeat the question. But I believe he was referring to his mother. He seemed to live on very intimate terms with her, but he never spoke about her, never invited me to his house. I scarcely knew what his mother looked like. Several times I attempted to imitate his example by concentrating my willpower on something so firmly that I would have to attain it. I had desires which seemed to me sufficiently pressing, but nothing came of it. I could not bring myself to talk matters over with Demian. I should not have been able to make him understand what I wanted. He did not ask either. My faith in matters of religion had meanwhile suffered many a breach. Yet, in my manner of thinking, which was entirely under the influence of Demian, I was to be distinguished from those of my schoolfellows who professed an entire disbelief. There were a few such who let occasional phrases be overheard, to the effect that it was laughable and unworthy of man's dignity to believe in a god, and that stories such as those of the Trinity and the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary were simply a joke. It was disgraceful, they said, that such rubbish was peddled about today. This was by no means my way of thinking, Even where I had doubts, my whole experience of my childhood taught me to believe in the efficacy of a godly life such as that led by my parents, which I knew to be neither contemptible nor hypocritical. On the contrary, now, as before, I had the greatest reverence for the spirit of religion. Only Demian had accustomed me to consider and explain the stories and articles of belief from a more liberal and more personal point of view. A point of view in which fantasy and imagination had their share. At least, I always took great pleasure and enjoyment in the interpretations he suggested to me. To be sure, much seemed to me too crude, such as the affair of Cain. And once, during the preparation for confirmation, I was terrified by a conception, which, if that were possible, seemed to me even more daring. The master had been speaking of Golgotha, the biblical account of the passion and death of Christ had, from my earliest years, made a deep impression on me. As a little boy, on such days as Good Friday, after my father had read out to us the story of the Passion, I had lived in imagination, and with much emotions, in Gethsemane and on Golgotha. In that world, so poignantly beautiful, pale and ghost-like, and yet so terribly alive. And when I listened to the Passion according to St. Matthew by Bach, I felt the mystical thrills of this dark, mysterious world of passion and suffering I find in this music even today, and in the Actus Tragicus, the essence of all poetry and of all artistic expression. At the conclusion of the lesson, Demian said to me contemplatively, "There's something in this, Sinclair, which I don't like. Read through the story. Consider it. There's something there which sounds insipid. I mean, this business of the two thieves, it's sublime, the three crosses standing side by side on the hill. But what about this sentimental story of the honest thief, which reads more like a tract? First he was a criminal who had perpetrated crimes, and God knows what, and now he breaks out in tears and is consumed by feelings of contrition and repentance. I ask you, what's the sense of such a repentance 2 steps from the grave? It's nothing but a real parson's story, mawkish and mendacious, larded with emotion, and having a most edifying background. If today you had to choose one of the 2 thieves as your friend, or if you consider which of the 2 you would the sooner have trusted, it would most certainly not be this weeping convert. No, it's the other, who's a real fellow with plenty of character. He doesn't care a straw about conversion, which is, in his case, can mean simply nothing more than pretty speeches. He goes his way bravely to the end, without being such a coward as to renounce the devil in the last moment, who up to that point has had to help him. He is a character, and in biblical history, people of character always come off second best. Perhaps he's a descendant of Cain. Don't you think so? I was dismayed. I had believed myself to be quite familiar with the story of the crucifixion. And now I saw, for the first time, what little personal judgment I had brought to bear on it. With what little force of imagination and of fantasy I had listened to it and read it. Demian's new ideas, therefore, were quite annoying, threatening to overthrow conceptions and stability of which I had believed it necessary to maintain. No one could have dealt with anything and everything like that. Certainly not with the all-holiest. Oh, jeez. Long day. As always, he noticed my opposition immediately, even before I had spoken a word. "I know," said he in a tone of resignation. "It's the old story. Everything is all right until you're serious about it. But I'll tell you something. This is one of the points where one can clearly see the shortcomings of this religion. The fact is that this God of the old and of the new dispensation may be an excellent conception, but he is not what he really ought to be. He is everything that is good, noble, fatherly, beautiful, sublime, and sentimental, certainly. But the world consists of other things, which are simply ascribed to the devil." That's Ben. Thank you very much. All this part of the world, a good half, is suppressed and hushed up, just the same as they praise God as the father of all life, but pass over the whole sex life, on which all life depends, and declare it to be sinful and the work of the devil. I have nothing to say against honoring this God Jehovah, nothing at all. But I think we should reverence everything, and look upon the whole world as sacred, not merely this artificially separated official half of it. We ought then to worship the devil as well as God. I should find that quite right. Or we ought to create a God who would embody the devil as well, and before whom we should not have to close our eyes when the most natural things in the world take place. Now here we are. Demian is starting to channel his Demian here. Contrary to his custom, he had become almost vehement, but he smiled again immediately, and pressed me no further. But in me, these words encountered the riddle of my whole boyhood, which I had hourly carried with me, but of which I had never spoken to anyone. What Demian had said about God and the devil, about the official godly world and the suppressed devil's world, that was exactly my own idea, my own myth, the idea of the two worlds, of the two halves of the world, the light and the dark. The realization that my problem was a problem of humanity as a whole, of life and thought in general, suddenly dawned on me. And this recognition inspired me with fear and awe, as I suddenly felt to what an extent my own innermost personal life and thought were part of the eternal stream of great ideas. The realization was not joyful, although it confirmed my mode of thought and made me happy to a certain extent. It was hard and tasted raw, because a hint of responsibility lay therein, telling me to put away childish things and to stand alone. I told my friend, the first time in my life, I had revealed so deep a secret of my conception of the two worlds, a conception which had been formed since the earliest years of my childhood. He saw at once that I was in thorough agreement with him. But he was not the kind to make the most of this. He listened with greater attention than he had ever given me, and looked me in the eyes until I had to turn away. Again I noticed in his look this odd, animal-like timelessness, this inconceivably old age. "We will talk more about that another time," he said considerably. "I see that you think more than you can express. But if that is so, then you also know that you have never lived in experience all that you have thought, and that is not good. Only the thought that we live through in experience has any value. You knew that your world of sanction was simply one half of the world, and yet you tried to suppress the other half in you, as do the parsons and teachers. You will not succeed. No one succeeds who has once begun to think. This impressed me deeply. "But," I almost shouted, "there are horrible things which are really and actually forbidden. You can't deny that fact. And they're forbidden once for all, and so we must renounce them. I know, of course, that there are such things as murder and all possible kinds of vice, but shall I then, simply because such things exist, go and become a criminal?" "We shan't be able to finish our discussion today," said Max in a milder tone. "You must certainly not commit murder or rape. No. But you haven't yet reached that point where one can see what is permitted and what is really taboo. You have realized only a part of the truth. The remainder will come after. Rely on it. For instance, the past year or so, you have had in you an instinct which is stronger than all the others, and which is held to be taboo. The Greeks and many other people, on the contrary, made a sort of divinity out of this instinct, and honored it by great celebrations. What is now taboo is therefore not eternally so. It can change. Today, everyone is permitted to sleep with a woman as soon as he has been with her to a parson, and has gone through the ceremony of marriage. With other races it is different, even today. For that reason, each one of us must find out for himself what is permitted and what is forbidden. That is, to himself. You never need do anything that is forbidden, and yet be a thorough rascal. And vice versa. It is really merely a question of convenience. Whoever is too lazy to think for himself, and to constitute himself his own judge, simply conforms to the taboos, whatever they happen to be. He has an easy time of it. Others realize they carry laws in themselves. For them, they are forbidden. For them, things are forbidden with every man of honor does daily. On the other hand, things are permitted for them which are otherwise taboo. Everyone must stand up for himself. Suddenly, he seemed to regret having said so much, and broke off. I felt I could understand, to a certain extent, what his sentiment was. That is to say, however agreeably he used to present his ideas, apparently in a cursory manner, he could on no account tolerate a conversation that made simply for the sake of talking, as he once said. He realized, in my case, that although my interest was genuine enough, I was much too inclined to look upon discussion as a game, too fond of clever talking. In short, I was lacking in perfect seriousness. As I again read the words I have just written, perfect seriousness, another scene suddenly comes into my mind. The most impressive experience I lived through with Max Demian in those still half-childlike times. Our confirmation classes were drawing to an end, and the closing lessons were devoted to the Last Supper. The clergyman thought this very important, and he took pains to make us feel something of the inspiration and sacred character of his teaching. However, precisely in those last few lessons, thoughts were diverted to another topic, another object, to the person of my friend, looking forward to my confirmation, which was explained to us as being our solemn admission into the community of the Church. The thought presented itself imperatively to me that the value of this half year's religious instruction did not lie for me in what I had learned in class, but rather in Demian's presence and influence. It was not into the Church that I was ready to be received, but into something else. into an order of ideas and of personalities which surely existed somewhere or other on earth, and of which I felt my friend was the representative or messenger. I tried to repress this thought. In spite of everything, I earnestly intended to go through the ceremony of confirmation with a certain dignity, and the new notions I was forming seemed scarcely compatible with this. Yet, do what I would, the idea was there, and gradually identified itself with the approaching religious ceremony. I was ready to celebrate it, in a different fashion from the other confirmation candidates. For me, it would mean admission into a world of ideas, with which I had become acquainted through Demian. In those days, it happened that I had another discussion with him. It was just before a lesson. My friend was wrapped up in himself and took little pleasure in my talk, which was perhaps rather precocious and bombastic. "We talk too much," he said with unwonted gravity. "Wise speeches have no value at all. Absolutely none. You only escape from yourself. To escape from yourself is a sin. You should be able to creep right into yourself, like a tortoise." We entered the schoolroom immediately after. The lessons began. I took pains to listen, and Demian did not disturb me in my effort. For a while, I began to feel something peculiar at my side. As if his seat had... No, wait, missed. Okay. Something peculiar at my side where his place was. A sort of emptiness or coolness or something like that. As if his seat had suddenly become vacant. The feeling became oppressive, and I turned round. There I saw my friend sitting, upright and in his customary attitude, but he looked quite different from usual. Something I did not know went out from him, enveloped him. I thought his eyes were closed until I saw he held them open. But they were stiff, as if gazing within or directed to an object a great way off. He sat there, perfectly motionless. He seemed not to be breathing, and his mouth was as if carved out of wood or stone. His face was white, abnormally white, as stone. His brown hair showed more signs of life than did any other feature. His hands lay before him on the desk, without life, as still as inanimate objects, like stones or fruit, white and motionless, yet not relaxed, but as if controlling the secret springs of a powerful life force. The sight made me tremble. "He's dead," I thought. I almost said it out loud, but I knew he was not dead. Mesmerized, I hung on his look. His eyes were riveting to this white stone mask. I felt it was the real Demian. The Demian who was in the habit of walking and talking with me. That was only one side of him. A half. Demian... Demian, who from time to time played a part, who accommodated himself to circumstances out of mere complacence. But the real Demian looked like this, with just this look of stone, prehistorically old, like an animal, beautiful and cold, dead, yet secretly full of fabulous life force. And around him, this still emptiness, this infinite ethereal space, this lonely death. He has quite retired into himself, I felt with a shudder. Never had I been so isolated. I had no part in him. He was unattainable. He was further from me than if he had been on the most distant isle in the world. I scarcely understood why no one besides myself noticed it. I thought that everyone would have to remark him, that everyone would shudder. But no one gave him any attention. He sat like a picture, and, as I could not prevent myself from thinking, as stiff as a strange idol. A fly settled on his forehead, moved slowly down over his nose and lips. Not a muscle, not a nerve in his face twitched. Where was he now? What was he thinking? What was he feeling? Was he in heaven or in hell? It was impossible for me to question him. When I saw him at the end of the lesson, living and breathing again, when his glance met mine, was he as he formerly had been? Where did he come from? Where had he been? He seemed tired. His face had its normal color. His hands moved again, but his brown hair was lustrous and fatigued, as it were. In the days following, I practiced a new exercise in my bedroom several times. I sat stiffly on a chair, kept my eyes fixed, and held myself perfectly motionless. I waited to see how long I could maintain this attitude, and what the sensation would be like. However, I merely got very tired, and suffered from a violent twitching of the eyelids. The confirmation took place soon after, of which no important recollections remain within me. Everything was now quite changed. Childhood fell upon me in ruins. My parents used to look at me with a certain embarrassment. My sisters had become quite strange in their conduct toward me. A disillusionment falsified and weakened the old sentiments and pleasures. The garden was without fragrance. The wood no longer inviting. The world around me seemed like a clearance sale of old articles. Inspired and without charm. Books were insipid and without charm. Books were merely paper, music, and noise. The leaves fall thus from a tree in autumn. The tree feels it not. Rain drips on it, sun comes and frost, and the life in it recedes slowly into the narrowest and most inward recesses. The tree is not dying. It is waiting. It was decided that after the holidays I should go to another school, leaving home for the first time. My mother, meanwhile, approached me with a special tenderness, a sort of preliminary goodbye, endeavoring to charm me with a love from which I should go with homesickness and unforgetfulness in my heart. Demian had gone away. I was alone. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 3. So we see the reunion and final, or not final necessarily, but eventual splitting back up of Emil and Demian. The continued evolution of Emil's thoughts, ideas, and conceptions of what the world is, what religion is, what philosophy is, what he is, how he fits into it, how his friend fits into it. And very interesting suggestions keep being brought up. And that's not to say that they're entirely wrong. It's a very, from a philosophical point of view, a lot of it makes very good sense. And it feels very much like a freshman philosophy class with that one kid who constantly raises his hand and asks so many questions, and that are less questions and more leading ways to espouse his own musings. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting here. I'm not sure if I'm getting that vibe more from Emil or from Demian here, but they're both sort of sharing in that. Yeah, for their age, it's not that strange. It fits very well. It was annoying when we were in class and had to suffer through it, but when you're that age, remember, Demian is a little bit older. He's like probably 16, 17 at this point. And Emil is a little younger. He's probably around 13ish. In the smack dab of puberty, right when they're doing confirmation. So that's when you're exploring your own mind. Finding the interactions between your mind, your sense of self and your sense of the world and the reality of the world. You're figuring it out. Your brain is just developed enough to the point that it can start asking those questions. So it makes sense. It's all very valid. But the memories that I have of myself, whether it be me or those around me who were going through that, you get a little bit of insufferability. You get a little bit of deep-seated cringe. You're just like, oh, went through one of those phases, huh? Yeah. Everyone does it, but you like to think that your own little phase is unique. Whether it's uniquely cringeworthy, or you have some unique insight into the deeper truths of the universe. Most people fall into the former. Very few fall into the latter. Yeah. Yeah. You see, like, old notes or old posts or things you wrote in the margins or things that had previously been favorite books, and you look back at them now and you're like, oh my god, how did I read this? How did I write this? Oh no. Yeah, we all do it. That's a universal human trait, is as the mind catches up. Yeah, because I was in that early adoption era of social media where, like, those early years was like when MySpace was starting to come out. Facebook was still university only when I was getting an account. So that was relatively safe place. But things like that were a lot harder to come by. You'd have to go deep, find a forum to express yourself in, or forbid, take up poetry in a notebook or something. All right, so we are just a little bit past 9. Let's go ahead and take a few minutes now. Stand up, stretch your legs, top up your drinks, do what we must to try and shake some life back into things, because I don't know about you, I'm fading. It's been a long day. Had to go to the office today, which adds about a solid 3 hours to my commute. Hour and a half each way or so, which means, oh, it's a day. So, we'll be back in just a little bit. I need to get the blood pumping a little bit here. We'll be back. Thanks. All right, we are back. All right, let me take a look and see how long the previous chapter was. We'll get a gauge for how likely we are to finish this next one. It's a tiny bit longer. We might either have to run a little. Well, we've killed some time here. I think we're gonna have to find a spot midway to stop in this one, because otherwise, it's at that awkward point where if we power through, it likely will be about half past, and that's a little bit much for me. So let's just keep it going for now, and we'll get what we can. Dude, you can sit there right when I'm trying to get started. I need the mouse. Yes. Hello, Simba. I didn't even catch it there. Huh. You know the worst part about Freudian slips like that? You don't even catch them. I'm not even sure it even crossed my mind what it was. Oh, okay, yeah. That could do it. That would be appropriate. No. The awkward age I'm at now is the point where I like afternoon naps, and when I don't get one, things get a little fuzzy. That's my awkward age right now. Yeah, little man is consistently in the way whenever he decides to feel like it. Little man is not so little. Takes up half the damn desk. Yes. All right, let's get started here. We'll get partway through this chapter in any case, and we'll see if we find a convenient place to trail off. Chapter 4. Beatrice. Without having seen my friend again, I traveled at the end of the holidays to St. Both my parents came with me, and handed me over with all possible care to the protection of a master of the school, in whose house I was to board. They would have been numb with horror had they only known to what sort of fate they were leaving me. It still hung in the balance whether I should become, with time, a good son and a useful citizen, or whether my nature would break out in other directions. My last attempt to be happy under the roof of my father's house and the spirit prevailing there had lasted for a considerable period, and at times had almost succeeded, only in the end to fail completely. The curious emptiness and isolation which I had begun to feel for the first time in the holidays after my confirmation, how I learned to know it later, this emptiness, this thin atmosphere, did not pass immediately. The parting from home was, for me, particularly easy. I was really rather ashamed of not being sadder. My sisters wept without reason. I could not. I was astonished at myself. I had always been an emotional child, and at bottom tolerably good. Now I was quite changed. I was completely indifferent towards the outside world. Little man, that tail slam? You're clicking things. Stop clicking things. For days together, my sole occupation was hearkening to my inner self, listening to the flood of dark, forbidden instincts which roared subterraneously within me. I had grown very quickly in that last half year, and appeared lanky, thin, and immature. The amiability of boyhood had completely disappeared from my character. I realized myself that it was impossible to like me thus. Yeah, disruptive is the name of the game tonight with Mr. Simba. He's not really getting up in my business, but he's making sure that the tail is doing whatever tails do. Yes. Okay. I had often a great longing for Max Demian. On the other hand, I hated him not seldom, and looked upon him as responsible for the moral impoverishment of my life, to which I resigned myself as to a sort of nasty disease. In the beginning, I was neither liked nor respected in our school boarding house. First, they ragged me, then kept out of the way, looking upon me as a rotter and an eccentric character. I was pleased with myself, and I even overplayed my part, withdrawing into my solitary self, growling occasional cynicism. Superficially, I appeared to despise the world in a most manly fashion, whereas in reality I was secretly consumed by melancholy and despair. In school, I could fall back on a knowledge amassed at home. The form I was in was not so advanced as the same form in the school I had just left, and so I acquired the habit of despising my school contemporaries, regarding them as mere children. This attitude lasted a year and longer. My first holiday visits at home brought no change. I went gladly away again. It was in the beginning of November. I had formed the habit of taking short, meditative walks in all kinds of weather, during which I often experienced a sort of joy. A joy full of melancholy, contempt of the world and contempt of self. I was sauntering thus one evening through the damp, foggy twilight in a suburb of the town. The broad drive of a public park stood completely deserted, inviting me to enter. The road lay thick with fallen leaves, into which I dug voluptuously with my feet. It smelt damp and bitter. In the distance, the trees stood up tall and shadowy, ghost-like in the fog. At the end of the drive, I stood still and undecided, staring into the black foliage, scenting eagerly the damp odor of decomposition and death, which seemed to be in harmony with my own mood. Oh, how insipid life tasted. A man with the collar of his raincoat blowing about him came out of a side path. I was just going on when he called to me. "Hello, Sinclair!" It happened to be Alphonse Beck, the senior boy of the house. I was always glad to see him, and had nothing against him, except that he always treated me as he did all the younger boys, in an ironical and grandfatherly manner. He passed for being as strong as a bear, was said to have great influence on the housemaster, and was the hero of many school stories. "What are you doing here?" he asked affably, in the tone the seniors always used when they condescended on occasion to talk to us. "Composing verse, I bet?" "Shouldn't dream of it," I disclaimed gruffly. He laughed, came up to me, and we chatted together in a manner to which I had not been accustomed for some time past. "You needn't be afraid, Sinclair. That I shouldn't understand. I know the feeling. When one goes for a walk on a foggy evening, the thoughts of autumn inspires in one, and one writes poetry about dying nature, of course, and spent youth, which is very much like it. Read Heinrich Heine?" "I am not so sentimental," I said in self-defense. "Oh, all right. But in this weather, I think it does a man good to find a quiet place where one can take a glass of wine or something. Are you coming with me for a bit? I happen to be quite alone. Or wouldn't you care to? I wouldn't like to lead you astray, old man, if you're one of those model boys." A little while after, we sat clinking our thick glasses in a little tavern in the suburbs, drinking wine of a doubtful quality. At first I wasn't much pleased. Still, it was rather a novelty for me. But unaccustomed to wine, I soon became talkative. It was as if a window had been flung open within me, and the world shining in. For how long, how terribly long, had I not eased my heart by talking? I gave full play to my imagination, and once started, I related the story of Cain and Abel. Beck listened to me with pleasure. Someone, at last, to whom I was giving something. He clapped me on the shoulder, told me I was the devil of a good fellow, and a clever rascal. How I reveled in communicating my opinions, as I relieved myself of all the pent-up thought of the past months. My heart swelled with pride at finding my talents recognized by someone older than I was. When he called me a clever rascal, the effect was like a sweet, strong wine running through me. The world lit up in new colors. Thoughts came to me as from 100 sources. Wit and fire blazed up in me. We spoke of masters and schoolfellows, and I thought we understood one another wonderfully well. We talked of Greeks and of pagans, and Beck wished absolutely to draw me out on the subject of women. But on this point, I could not converse. I had no experience, nothing to relate. True, all that I had felt and imagined was burning within me, but I could not impart my thoughts, not even under the influence of wine. Beck knew much more about girls, and I listened to his tales with glowing eyes. The things I heard were unbelievable. What I should never have conceived to be possible entered the sphere of commonplace reality and seemed self-evident. Alphonse Beck, who was perhaps 18 years old, was already a man of experiences. Among other things, he told me that girls liked boys to play the gallant with them, but in general were too afraid to go any further. You could hope for more success with women. Women were much cleverer. For instance, there was Mrs. Jaggelt, who sold pencils and copybooks, who was much easier to deal with. All that had happened behind the counter in her shop was unprintable in any book. I sat on captivated. My head was swimming. To be sure, I could not exactly have loved Mrs. Jaggelt, but still, it was unheard of. It seemed as if things happened, at least to older people, of which I had never dreamed. There was a false ring about it, to be sure. Everything seemed more trivial and commonplace, and did not coincide with my own ideas about love. But still, it was reality. It was love and adventure. Someone sat next to me who had lived it in experience, to whom it seemed a matter of course. Our conversation had reached a lower level, had deteriorated. I was no longer a clever little fellow. I was just a mere boy listening to a man. But even then, in comparison with what my life had been for months and months, this was delicious. This was heaven. Besides, as I gradually began to realize, all this was forbidden, absolutely forbidden. Everything from sitting in a public house down to the subject of our conversation. In any case, I thought I was showing spirit. I was in revolt. I can recollect that night with the greatest clearness. We, both of us, wended our way home at a late hour, under the dimly burning gas lamps through the cool, damp night. For the first time in my life, I was drunk. It was not agreeable. It was in the highest degree unpleasant. But there was a sort of charm about it, a sweetness. It smacked of orgy and revolt, of spirit and life. Beck bravely took me in hand, and although he grumbled at me as being a bloody novice, he half carried, half dragged me home, where, by good fortune, he was able to smuggle us both through a window which stood open on the ground floor. But a maddening pang accompanied the sobering up, as I painfully awoke after a short, heavy sleep. I sat up in bed and saw that I was still wearing my shirt. My clothes and shoes lay round about on the floor, smelling of tobacco and vomit. And between headache, nausea, and a maddening thirst, a picture came before my mind on which I had not set eyes for many a long day. I saw my home, the house where dwelt my parents. I saw father and mother, my sisters and the garden. I saw my peaceful, homely bedroom, the school, and the marketplace, Demian and the confirmation class, and all this was bright, lustrous, all was wonderful, godly, and pure. All that, I realize now, had until yesterday belonged to me, had waited for me, but now, in this hour, it was mine no longer. It spurned me, and looked upon me with disgust. All that was loving and intimate, all that I had received from my parents since the first golden days of my childhood, each kiss mother had given me, each Christmas, each godly, bright Sunday morning there at home, each flower in the garden, all that was laid waste. I had trampled on it all with my foot. If the police had come for me then, and had bound me away and led me away to the gallows as a desecrator and as the scum of humanity, I should have acquiesced, should have gone gladly. I would have found it right and fitting. It's good to see the man does not grow out of the boyish panic at the smallest of wrongdoings. I guess the young man, but you know what I mean. He'll probably have another of these outbursts in the full flower of maturity. That was the state of my feelings. I, who had gone about despising the world. I, who had been so proud in spirit, and who had shared Demian's thoughts. So I appeared a filthy pig, to be classed with the scum of the earth, drunk and befouled, disgusting and common, a dissolute beast carried away by abominable instincts. So I appeared, I, who came from those gardens whose bright flowers had been purity and sweet gentleness, I, who had loved Bach's music and beautiful poetry. I could still hear with aversion and disgust my own laugh, the drunken, uncontrolled, convulsive, and silly laugh which escaped me. That was I. But in spite of everything, there was a certain enjoyment in suffering these torments. I had lived for so long, a blind, dull existence. For so long had my heart been silent, impoverished, and shut up, that even this self-accusation, this self-aversion, this entirely dreadful feeling was welcome. At least it was feeling. Flowers were flaring up, emotion was quivering therein. I experienced in the midst of my misery a confused sensation of liberation, of the approach of spring. This is, to put it in context, this is before they invented cutting for self-harm. However, as far as outward appearances went, I was going fast down the hill. The first debauch was soon followed by others. There was much drinking at school, and other things not in accord with study. I was among the youngest who carried on in this way, but from being just tolerated and looked upon as a mere youngster, I soon rose to be considered as a leader and a star. I was renowned as a daredevil and could drink with the best. Once again, I belonged entirely to the dark world, to the devil. I passed in this world for being a splendid fellow. But at the same time, I was in a pitiful state of mind. I lived in a whirl of self-destroying debauchery, and while I was looked up to by my friends as a leader and the devil of a good fellow, as a cursed, witty, and spirited drinking companion, my anxious soul was full of apprehension. I remember on one occasion tears started to my eyes when, on coming out of a tavern one Sunday morning, I saw children playing in the street, bright and contented, with freshly combed hair and in their Sunday clothes. And while I amused and often terrified my friends with monstrous cynicisms, as we sat at dirty tables stained with puddles of beer in low public houses, I had in my heart a secret, deep reverence for everything at which I scoffed. Inwardly, I was weeping bitterly for the thought of my past life, of my mother, of God. there is good reason for the fact that I was never one with my companions. That I remained lonely, even in their midst. That I suffered in the manner above described. I was a hero of drinking bouts, with the roughest of them. I was a scoffer after their own heart. I showed courage and wit in my ideas and in my talks about masters, school, parents, the church. I listened to their smutty stories unflinchingly, and even ventured one or two myself. But I was never about when my boon companions went off with girls. I remained behind alone, filled with an ardent desire for love, a hopeless longing, whereas, to judge from my conversation, I must have been a hardened rake. No one was more vulnerable, no one more chaste than I. And when, from time to time, I saw young girls pass by in the town, pretty and clean, bright and charming, they seemed to me like a wonderful, pure dream women, 1,000 times too good and too pure for me. For a long time, I could not bring myself to enter Mrs. Jangle's stationery shop, because I blushed when I saw her and the thought of what Alphonse Beck had told me about her. The more I realized how different I was from the members of my new set, how isolated I was in their midst, the less easy it was, for that very reason, to break up with them. I do not really know whether the topping and bragging ever caused me much pleasure, the toping. And I could never so accustom myself to hard drinking that I did not feel the painful consequences after each bout. I was as if coerced into doing this. I did it because I had to, because I was otherwise absolutely ignorant of a course to follow. I knew not where to begin. I was afraid of being long alone. I was frightened of the many tender, chaste, intimate moods to which I constantly felt myself inclined. I was afraid of the tender notions of love, which so often came to me. One thing I lacked most of all, a friend. There were 2 or 3 schoolfellows whom I liked very much, but they belonged to the good set, and my vices had for a long time been a secret to no one. They avoided me. Withal, I passed for a hopeless gamester, under whose feet the very earth quaked. The masters knew much about me. Severe punishments were several times inflicted on me. My final expulsion from the school was awaited for with more or less certainty. I knew that, for myself, for a long time, I had ceased to be a good pupil. I got through my work by hook or by crook, with the feeling that the state of affairs could not last much longer. There are many ways by which God can make us feel lonely and lead us to a consciousness of ourselves. With me, it was in this way. It was like a bad dream, in which I saw myself ostracized, foul and clammy, creeping restlessly and painfully over broken beer glasses, down an abominably unclean road. There are such dreams when you imagine you have set out to find a beautiful princess, but you stick in stinking back streets full of rubbish and dirty puddles. So it was with me. In this scarcely refined way, I was destined to become lonely, and to put between myself and my childhood a locked door of Eden, over against which stood merciless sentinels on guard in beaming rays of light. It was a beginning, an awakening of that homesickness, that longing to return to my true self. I was terribly frightened when my father, alarmed by a letter from my housemaster, appeared for the first time in St. Herfer, and faced me unexpectedly. When he came for the second time, towards the end of that winter, I was hard and indifferent. I let him heap blame on me. I let him beg me to think of my mother. I was unmoved. Finally, He grew very angry, and said that if I did not turn over a new leaf, he would have me disgraced and chased out of the school, and would have me placed in a reformatory. Little I cared. When he went away, I felt sorry for him, but he had accomplished nothing. He had found no approach to me, and for a few moments I felt that it served him right. I was indifferent as to what might become of me. In my peculiar and unlovely manner, with my carrying on and my frequenting of public houses, I was at odds with the world. This was my way of protesting. I was ruining myself thereby. But what of it? Sometimes the case presented itself to me in this wise. If the world had no use for such as me, if there was no better place for us, if there were no higher duties, then people like myself simply went to the devil. So much for the worse for the world. The Christmas holiday of that year were exceedingly unpleasant. My mother was terrified when she saw me again. I had grown taller, and my thin face looked gray and ravaged by dissipation, with flabby features and inflamed rings around the eyes. The first indication of a moustache, and the spectacles which I had but lately taken to wearing, made me look stranger still. My sisters started back and giggled when they saw me. It was all very pleasant. Unpleasant was the conversation with my father in his study. Unpleasant the greeting of a couple of relations. Unpleasant above all things was Christmas night. That had been, since my birth, the great day of our house, the evening of festivity and love, of gratitude, of the renewal of the bond between my parents and myself. This time, everything was depressing and embarrassing. As usual, my father read the portion of the gospel about the shepherds in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. As usual, my sisters stood radiantly before the table on which the presents were laid out, but my father's voice was sad, and he looked old and constrained. Mother was unhappy. For me, everything was equally painful and unwished for. Presents and good wishes, gospel and Christmas tree. The gingerbread smelt delicious and exhaled thick clouds as of sweet remembrances. The Christmas tree was fragrant and told things which existed no longer. I longed for the end of the evening and of the holidays. So passed the whole winter. It was not long before I was severely reprimanded by the faculty and threatened with expulsion. It could not last much longer. Well, it made no difference to me. I had a special grudge against Max Demian, whom I had not seen for the whole of this period. In my first term at St. Herfer, I had written to him twice, but had received no reply. For that reason, I had not paid him a visit in the holidays. All right, let's see if there's a second break here in this chapter, because this would be a good one, but... Okay, yeah, let's try and get to the next one. That seems like a good spot. In the same park where I had met Alphonse Beck in the autumn, it chanced that, in the first days of spring, just as the thorn hedges were beginning to turn green, a girl attracted my attention. I was out for a walk by myself, full of gnawing cares and thoughts, for my health was bad. Besides that, I was in continual financial embarrassment. I owed various sums to my friends, and had to invent excuses to procure some money from home. In several shops, I had run up accounts for cigars and such things. Not that these cares were very pressing. If the end of my school career was approaching, and if I drowned myself or was sent to a reform school, these trifles would not make much difference either. But I was Nevertheless, constantly facing these unpleasant things, and I suffered from it. On that spring day in the park, I met a girl who had a strong attraction for me. She was tall and slender, elegantly dressed, and had a wise, boyish face. She pleased me at once. She belonged to the type that I loved, and she began to work upon my imagination. She was scarcely older than I, but she was more mature. She was elegant and possessed a good figure, already almost a woman, but with a touch of youthful exuberance in her features, which pleased me exceedingly. It was never my good fortune to approach a girl with whom I could have fallen in love. Neither was it my luck in this case, but the impression was deeper than all the former ones, and the influence of this infatuation on my life was powerful. Suddenly, I had again a picture standing before me, a revered picture. And no need, no impulse was so deep or so strong in me as the desire to revere, to adore. I gave her the name of Beatrice, of whom, without having read Dante, I knew something from an English painting, a reproduction of which I had in my possession. Ooh, Dante. We should read Dante at some point. The picture was an English pre-Raphaelite girlish figure, very long-limbed and slender, with a small, long head and spiritualized hands and features. My beautiful young girl did not completely resemble this, although she had the same slenderness and boyish suppleness of figure, which I loved, and something of the spiritualization of the face, as if her soul lay within. I never spoke a single word to Beatrice. Yet at that time she exercised the deepest influence over me. Her picture fastened itself on my mind. In my imagination she opened a sanctuary for me. She caused me to pray in a temple. From one day to another I remained absent from the drinking bouts and the nightly excursions. Once more I could bear being alone. I read gladly. I liked to go for walks again. I think early on I had thought about doing Dante, but it felt like way too heavy to get into. But then we read Paradise Lost, and all thoughts of heaviness just went out the window. Because, I mean, seriously, that was basically like reading Genesis with a different point of view. So, if we can get through Paradise Lost, we can get through Dante. That's on the short list. I was much scoffed at for my sudden conversion, but I had now something to love and to worship. I had again an ideal. Life was once more full of suggestion, of gaily colored secret nuances that made me insensible to the jeers of my companions. I again felt at home with myself, although I was now the servant and slave of a picture which I revered. I cannot think of that time without a certain emotion. With earnest striving, I again endeavored to build a bright world out of the ruins of that period of my life which had broken up around me. I again lived entirely and single-mindedly in the desire to put away the dark and the bad, and to dwell completely in the light, on my knees before my gods. Still, this bright world I built up was, to a certain extent, my own creation. It was not the action of flying back or of crawling back to mother, to a security without responsibilities. It was a new service upon which I entered. Invented by myself for my own requirements, with responsibilities and discipline of self. The sex consciousness from which I suffered and before which I was in constant flight was now transmuted in this sacred fire to spirit and devotion. The grim and horrible would disappear. I should groan through no more agonizing nights. There would be no more heart beatings in front of lewd pictures. No more listening at forbidden doors, no more lasciviousness. Instead of all this, I set up my altar with the picture of Beatrice. And in dedicating myself to her, I dedicated myself to the spirit and to the gods. That part of myself which I withdrew from the powers of darkness, I brought as a sacrifice to the powers of light. Not lust was my aim, but purity. No happiness, but beauty and spirituality. Yeah, bro is an early adopter of parasocial behaviors. Getting in on the ground floor with this one. This cult for Beatrice completely changed my life. A precocious cynic but a short while before, I had now become a servant in the temple, whose aim it was to be a saint. I not only renounced the evil life to which I had accustomed myself, but I endeavored to change everything, to set myself a standard of purity, nobility, and dignity, which I even applied to eating and drinking, to my manner of speech and dress. I began each morning to wash with cold water, to the use of which I had in the beginning to force myself. I behaved with gravity and dignity, carried myself erect, and acquired a slower and more dignified gait. To an observer, it might have seemed rather ludicrous, but to me, it was the performance of a divine worship. Okay, we do poke fun, but it does seem, in general, to be a more healthier outlook for young Emile. Of all the ways in which I sought to find expression for my new faith, one bore fruit. I began to paint. Oh, there it is. He turns to art. Got it. To start with, the English picture of Beatrice I had in my possession did not bear a sufficient resemblance of Beatrice. I wanted to try to paint her for myself. Full of new pleasure and hope, I carried into my room — I had recently been given a room to myself — beautiful paper, colors, and a paintbrush. I made ready my palette, porcelain bowls, glass and pencils. The fine watercolors in little tubes which I had bought captivated me. There was a bright chromic green, which I think I can see yet as it flashed out for the first time from the little white tube. I began with caution. To paint a face was difficult. I wished first of all to try something else. I painted ornaments, flowers, and small landscapes from imagination. A tree near a chapel, a Roman bridge with cypresses. I often lost myself completely in this pastime. I was as happy as a child with a box of paints. At last, I began to paint Beatrice. Oh, yeah, you know what? Yeah, Manosphere's gotta just taint everything that it even comes adjacent to. Self-improvement. Sorry. Got too close to the sun there, Icarus. Tough cookies. Got yourself accidentally red-pilled by shaving and cleaning up. The first few attempts were abortive. I threw them away. The more I tried to conjure up in my mind the face of the girl whom I met from time to time in the street, the less I seemed able to transfer my impressions to paper. Finally, I gave up the idea, and began simply to paint a face, according to the guidance of my imagination, a face which gradually grew out of the one already begun, as if by itself, at the mercy of color and brush. The result was a face I had dreamed of, and I was not ill-pleased with it. Yet I made another essay immediately, and each new picture was clearer, and approached more nearly to the type, but was by no means like the reality. More and more I accustomed myself, in a dreamy sort of way, to draw lines with my brush, to fill in surfaces. My sketches grew out of a few strokes of the brush, out of the unconscious. At last, one day, I finished a face, almost unconsciously, but which made a stronger appeal to me than the former ones. It was not the face of the girl. I had long since given up the idea of trying to paint my Beatrice to the life. It was something else, something unreal, and yet not of less value for me on that account. It looked more like the head of a youth than of a girl. The hair was not blonde like that of my pretty girl, but brown, with a tinge of red. The chin was strong and firm, but the mouth was red as a blossom. The features were rigid, like a mask, but impressive and full of secret life. As I sat before the finished sketch, it made a peculiar impression on me. It seemed to me a sort of picture of a god, or of a sacred mask, half man, half woman, ageless, the expression being at once dreamy and strong-willed. Stiff and yet secretly alive. Its face seemed to have something to say to me. It belonged to me. Its look was rather imperative, as if requiring something of me, and there was a certain resemblance to someone or other, to whom I knew not. Yeah, there's some recollections at place here, and some connections that we can see that are assuredly not actually connections, but there's some vibes. The picture played an important role for a while, sharing my thoughts and my life. I kept it concealed in a drawer, in order that one should not get possession of it, and so be able to sneer at me. But as soon as I found myself alone in my little room, I took out the picture and communed with it. Each evening I pinned it on the wall over against my bed, and gazed at it until I dropped off to sleep. In the morning it was the first object which met my gaze. Just at that time, I began again to dream a great deal, as I had constantly done when a child. It seemed to me that for years I had had no more dreams. Now they came again, quite a new kind of pictures, and often the painted image appeared therein, living and speaking, friendly or inimical, with the features sometimes twisted into a grimace, sometimes infinitely beautiful, harmonious and noble. And one morning, as I awoke out of such a dream, I suddenly realized who was the original of the picture. I recognized it. It gazed at me in such a fabulously well-known way, and seemed to be calling my name. It seemed to know me like a mother, seemed to love me as if, since the beginning of time, with beating heart, I stared at the paper, at the thick brown hair, at the half-womanly mouth, the strong forehead with the wonderful brightness. It had dried that way of itself. And more I felt in me the knowledge, the certainty of having somewhere met the original of the picture. I sprang out of bed, placed myself in front of the face, and gazed at it from the closest proximity. Stared into the wide open, greenish staring eyes, the right eye somewhat higher than the other, and all at once this right eye twitched perceptibly, but still decidedly. And from this twitching, I recognized the picture. How was it that I had found it out so late? It was Demian's face. Later, I often compared the picture with Demian's real features, as they had remained in my memory. They were not quite the same, although there was a resemblance, but it was Demian nonetheless. Once, on an evening in early summer, the red sun shone obliquely through my window, which looked towards the west. In the room, the dusk was gathering. I suddenly had the idea of pinning the picture of Beatrice, or of Demian, to the crossbar of the window and gazing at it, while the evening sun was shining through. The whole outline of the face disappeared, but the reddish-ringed eyes, the brightness of the forehead, and the strong red mouth glowed deeply and wildly from the surface of the paper. I sat opposite it for a long time, even after the light had died away, and by degrees the feeling came to me that this was not Beatrice or Demian, but myself. The picture did not resemble me. It was not meant to, I felt. But there was that in it which seemed to be made up of my life. Something of my inner self, of my fate, or of my demon. My friend would look like that, if I ever found another. My mistress would look like that, if I ever had one. My life and death would be like that. It had the ring and rhythm of my fate. In those weeks I had begun to read a book which made a deeper impression on me than anything I had read before. Even in later years I have seldom chanced upon books which have made such a strong appeal to me, except perhaps those of Nietzsche. It was a volume of novellas, containing letters and apothegms. There was much that I did not understand, but the book containing letters and apothegms, but the book captivated me and occupied my thoughts to an extraordinary degree. One of the aphorisms now occurred to me. I wrote it with a pen under the picture. Fate and soul are the terms of one conception. This I now understood. I frequently used to meet the girl I called Beatrice. I felt no emotion on seeing her, but I was often sensible of harmony of sentiment, which seemed to say, we are connected. Or rather, not you and I, but your picture and I. You are a part of my destiny. Alright, let's go ahead and set a bookmark here. So yeah, that was... That's we're getting back into the creepy artist territory. And not a surprise, but watch out for that picture. If it starts to look a little bit older, you got some issues. Yeah, bro is extra normal about everything. Extra normal. He does take absolutely no half measures. When he decides to fall in with a bad crowd as a child, he convinces them that he's a master thief and implicates himself in a crime that didn't actually exist, but nonetheless causes problems. When he decided to become a skeptic, all of a sudden, full-blown atheist. When he decided to become a drunkard and a carouser, man, oh man, village idiot, boom, done. And to fall in love with the idea of a woman, not fall in love with a woman, just fall in love with the idea of love. Man learns how to paint. Ay. Yeah. So, say what you will about our Emil here. He doesn't do half measures. He's in with both legs, diving in without even looking forward. But you could kind of respect that, if it wasn't so self-destructive about 75% of the time. But I'm interested to see how this shakes out next time, because this seems to us, yes, it's obviously not healthy, but it is more healthy than his previous patterns of behavior. So maybe it's not too late. And obviously this whole thing is just put together and framed as a retelling of one's memoirs. So obviously he's done okay for himself. Somewhat. Maybe. Alright, let's go ahead and call this here for tonight. There are, I think, looks like just the two of us tonight, and Tuesdays are usually pretty slow, so I don't think we'll need to bother with rating tonight. We've found some new friends as we've gone through, but weekdays just don't really happen too well. And that's fine. Gives us a nice night to just vibe. Alright, so I've enjoyed this so far. It's a different sort of book than what we usually read, but that's not to gainsay it. The explorations of the psyche of the man as he's growing up, growing from a boy into a man, and from a young man into a man failure, and from there into a I don't know. The progressions and the mental states in each are well put forth and interesting to see how it shapes out. It does have it stings of a train wreck where you're watching it but can't quite look away, but there's a reason we like to watch train wrecks. Yeah, he's done well with running the gamut from being insufferable to being, well, in his own ways. So I'm enjoying this. It was a happy accident that we found this book, and I will continue to randomly search through Gutenberg's top hits in random categories in hopes of finding things like this, because you know what, variety and all spice of life and such. But we do have a growing backlog of other things. Z had passed along a book of other folklore, but I figured it was too soon for more folklore when we'd just come off of Arabian Nights. We can go back to Arabian Nights. I just want to find a better translation. That one was way too British. Well. All right, guys, let's go ahead and wrap up here. We ran a little bit over, but not terribly so. But it is time for me to tuck in for a little while. We'll be back on Friday with our next reading of Demian. Things are shaping up rather nicely. So we'll be back on Friday at our usual 8 o'clock. And then we'll see where we end up. We're just under halfway here. So it's looking like we likely will have 3 more readings to finish up. And that's fair. A 5-parter is certainly barely even a blip on the radar compared to some of our readings. Don Quixote. So, 3 Musketeers. Also fun books, but man, those took up months. All right. Let's go ahead and break here. As always, thank you very, very much for joining us. If you're over on YouTube, a like on the stream and a subscription to the channel would not be remiss. It invites the algorithm to send people our way. Lets them know that we do some fun things, and, you know, good books are always a good time. If you're over on Twitch, we're just getting started. We started it in late January, and we have, as of today, 22 followers. We are getting very near to the first big break point, or the first big goal point of 25, where we will be eligible for affiliate. I'm still not sure whether or not we actually will bother with it. I would have to learn how to manage ads, and that does not sound like a wonderful time to me. But we'll figure out what we want to do anyway. Despite it all, It's a fun landmark to say you qualify, right? All right. That's enough shilling from me tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope to see you next time as we continue this reading on Friday. Until then, have a good night. Bye now.